when we have a fairly complex scene to draw with lots of elements at various distances, how do we do it? How do we draw it in a way? How do we start and progress the drawing so that we keep the scale consistent, that we keep our proportions correct, that we start in the best place that will give us the greatest chance? Let me demonstrate my method with this really wonderful Italian town. So I start, if possible, in the center, because if we start in the center and radiate out, if any small errors creep in, they can only go at most half the page, half the drawing, half the scene. If we start at the top or the bottom and errors creep in, then the errors can magnify more, if you like. So I find that by starting in the center where possible gives me the best chance to keep the scene as tight as possible across the whole scene, the whole 360 degrees. So I start with this center section, this building in the central part of our drawing. And I start with those top two rectangles because they're a relatively easy shape to draw, and to draw in the correct proportions. Because if I get them correct and then I can come down from that, that gives me a working section then that's a bit larger to expand out from, aligning with upwards and downwards and horizontally. I make a point of drawing all of these windows smaller than I think they're going to be, because invariably we often don't leave enough room to allow for the thickness of the pen, which ends up being added to the visual effect of the width of the window. And if it's a very narrow window, then the thickness of the pen can add a substantial amount. And if the windows look too large, if they in fact are too large, then it gives the effect of the building being smaller than it really is. So I'm working hard at making the windows smaller than I think. It's the same when I do heads on figures in crowd scenes. I always do the head smaller than I think because I can always stick a beret on top or add more hair. But if the head's too large, it really throws the whole thing out. So having done this section here that I've done, it's been relatively straightforward just to go horizontally and vertically from my starting point. All the time trying to keep it tight, trying not to go too wide, particularly on the walls that are moving away from us at an angle. But now that I've moved into doing some trees, it's a little more dependent on careful observation, because these organic shapes aren't as straightforward to capture the proportion in our mind as easily as more geometric shapes. So I just switched now from my 0.2 millimeter pen to a 0.3 millimeter pen to do this lamppost, which actually is in the foreground. And I do intend to use a heavier pen for the foreground. Now in real time, this drawing took me 80 minutes to draw. It's one of my longest drawings that I've done for YouTube. So it's sped up 4 times. So if you want to see it slower, you can use the cog icon that you can see on your screen, and you can reduce it to half the speed I've posted it as, which would bring it back down to double speed. So if you'd like to do that, then you can. But in the meantime, I am now doing some hatching. Now, one of the great joys of this scene, I think, is the strong contrast, the brilliant light that lights up all the golden browns of the stonework and the countryside. Now, of course, I can't show that with a black ink drawing, but I can show the contrast between the white of the walls and the shadow. So I want to go fairly dark with my hatching, and I'm coming down now to, in my mind, where the building gets where the drawing gets a bit more difficult, which is down towards ground level, because then I get quite a lot of layers very close together. I get this grass at the front, I get this very visually dominant fence, there's another fence behind it, and then there's a row of parked cars nose in behind that, and then there's a couple of rows of cars behind that. And then there's the footpath at the base of the wall. So the complexity of the scene makes it even more important to keep everything very tight with the alignment, because otherwise I'm going to run out of space at the bottom of the page. So now I've started the railing, because as I did with the lamppost, I need to do the closest things before I do further things that sit behind them, because that way I can ensure that the closest things just stay a little more visually prominent. And this first section takes longer to do. I've got to line up the crisscross section. There are some very bright shadows on it, which I think are quite important for continuing the effect of sunshine into the foreground. Even though the shadows don't take up a large amount of the subject, they are a great contrast. It is always good to try and get high contrast of values next to each other. Really dark darks next to really light lights, or preferably, as in this case, black and white. So now I switch back to these roofs. I must admit, these roofs were a bit tricky to exactly work out what was happening, which is a good indication that probably I don't need to fuss too much, as long as what I draw looks credible. Basically, as long as it takes up the same space. And so now I push out to the extreme left of these midground buildings. And again, I'm just looking at the geometric shapes that I need to create. I'm not thinking at all of buildings, I'm thinking of shapes, I'm thinking of rectangles, I'm thinking of proportions. These two very small windows sit so far back to one side in the reference, and I want to replicate that in my drawing. So trying to work out now some of the details where it starts to get more complex. Trying to position the rest of these posts. And then work at some of the shadows. I hadn't at this stage really thought too hard about what I was going to do about the shadows, whether I was going to show them down here as much as they are, but I did decide that I would begin, because it would help me create more contrast next to each other, which would help us to then sort out the forms that we were looking at more easily. So I decided that I need to get the vertical line of this building at the extreme left in place. So I need to just space out the buildings yet to be drawn. Then I can get that line in, and then I can establish the left-hand edge of my scene, and that will help me. If you look, you'll see I've got 4 pencil dots that represent the actual size corners of my reference. I find that particularly when I'm drawing on camera and I don't want my drawing to go out of view, it's a good way just to help me check my proportions. Now, I've gone for my 0.1mm pen, and I'm doing these far distant rolling hills. I'm not getting too hung up on exactly replicating what's there, but I do want to give a sense that these hills are rolling, that they're undulating. So I don't really want any horizontal lines. I want some nice angled lines that angle into each other. And I also want to indicate that in the distance there, it's a darker value representing the colours of the trees. So now I think I need to establish my right-hand edge of the larger scene, which is defined by this closest tree. So I'm doing the outline, and then I think, I meant to switch to a 0.3. So I now have switched to my 0.3, And I'm not really wanting to draw the tree at this stage as just to reserve the paper that I want the tree to be on, so I don't draw horizontal lines into it, so that I don't continue my buildings that I'm yet to draw on the right hand side into the tree space. So I've now worked that out, and now I can continue these trees. And then I'm still aligning. I've positioned the gates according to the lamppost, which I positioned against the fence and the building parts that I'd drawn. And now I'm positioning these upper parts against the gates and against the lamppost. So once we get a momentum of accuracy going, the accuracy builds on accuracy. It's a great feeling when it starts to work out, particularly in a fairly complex scene, because it does create greater confidence as we go on. But particularly when the alignments become and the scale becomes more complex, as this does once we start to do behind this front fence, it's even more important that what we've already drawn is fairly accurate in terms of its placement and scale and proportions. So now I want to get the tree blocked in. Doing some more work on the trees. I decide to make this far conical tree darker than the others. It is actually a bit darker, the local colour in the reference, so I decide to make it darker. It's often good to vary the hatching on trees to make some of them a different shade to others, just to help create more separation, even when it's not particularly there in life. So now I do this stump, and straight away I mess up where I've put the shade lines, but it's really on such an extremity of the drawing that it's really just seen anyway out of the corner of the eye, so I'm not too worried about that. So now I'm defining this fence that sits beyond the closest fence. And I'm working to align the posts according to what they sit under higher up, because that gives me an indication of how accurate I am. However, if putting them exactly under whatever they're under in the reference photo means they look too close or too far, I will always adjust them so that the drawing looks okay. We don't want to cut off our nose to spite our face. So now I've gone back into this bottom left corner working on this shrub, which is a nice way of both taking up a bit of space but also helping to define by negative space the fence, which is helpful once it goes into shade. So once I hatch over the fence towards the end, it will still be quite clearly visible because the tree provides a strong value contrast. So again, just working on some windows that and then some hatching. I go over this hatching again a bit later to make it a bit darker. It's probably not the best hatching. I don't know why I just didn't do it in a straight line down the whole length of the building. If I was going to do it floor by floor, I should have stopped it more carefully in a straight line. So now I get to what for me is the most difficult part, which is drawing the vehicles. And I don't find vehicles the easiest object to draw anyway, but maybe that's helpful because it just really forces me to observe more carefully. So there are some cars that are parked nose in at this point, and then there's one or two rows of cars behind. And so I need to draw the cars behind so that the furthest one looks like it's sitting against the footpath that runs in front of the wall. And that's going to be the challenge, that we get the scale of the cars correct so that they look the size a car would look in that position from this distance, and that there looks as if there's a credible road surface, and that if a person walked down between the car closest to the footpath and that stone fence, that they would fit there, and the scale of the person would work with the gates behind them and the wall, but also with the cars. So this is always the challenge. And while they're not probably my best cars, and it is made more complicated by all the things that interrupt them, and the fact that I'm not drawing them exactly in the same positions as in the reference, because some of the objects that interrupt our view of the cars in the reference don't line up exactly with what they're blocking in my drawing. So I have to block things we can see in the reference and vice versa. But I'm reasonably happy with how the cars are going. In the end, they are a secondary subject. We're first of all going to see, I would think, the buildings in the centre of the drawing, and then we're going to see this very visually dramatic and dramatically angled fence down in the front. So the cars in some ways are more a peripheral subject, even though they're not around the edges. They're peripheral in the sense that they're not something that we see with any great or immediate focus. And so there are more cars parked down in the lower left section. But down there it's even more important that I just suggest with fairly accurate car-like shapes. Whenever we're drawing cars, I think it is really helpful to try and, at least in some of the views or angles or positions we draw the cars, get a side mirror visible, because side mirrors are one of those things that instantly says car. And there's a lot of negative spacing with the fence railings, so it's important to try and preserve the white that I've outlined with the fences. Now I want to do some indication of stonework on that fence. These are the stones, the individual stones that are closest to us. And now I've pretty much done most of the subjects in this, and I'm really thinking about value, and particularly for this closest section, and thinking about hatching. And I decide I will do this shadow that's on the ground, and just a few details that I haven't done, some indication of the terracotta tiling. Wondering, is there anything I can do for this abominable hatching on the side of the building? And then I decide that I'll hatch over the fence railing down this lower section and make it a little bit darker on the grass, without wanting to go as black as it is in the reference. I feel like that will just draw the eye too much. So really at the stage where we're just looking and making adjustments, and I decide that this tree needs to be a little bit darker overall, just to give a better contrast, let the buildings and the scenes behind stand out more. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I hope you've enjoyed watching this demo. I hope you have a go drawing this scene yourself. It's not straightforward, but if you want to practice careful observation and drawing really tightly in proportion and scale, it's a good example to do that. So you'll find this photo on my channel community page. It's not one of my photos, but it is used with the permission of the photographer. But look, whatever you draw and however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.